The next person who's going to present today, Steven Singer, is a clinical professor at Loyola Law School in New Orleans. He's a graduate of this law school and clerked in the D.C. Circuit and then joined the Public Defender Service in D.C., where he served in a variety of leadership roles. But I met Steve when I was down as an intern in Louisiana just after Hurricane Katrina. And when you went in the courtroom, you saw a mass of people waiting to be processed for arraignment, essentially. And they would get up and they would say, there'd be one lawyer who said, "I'm your lawyer today, right? I'll be your lawyer today," to everybody in the room. People would come up one by one, and the judge would say, "How do you plead?" And the person would say, "Not guilty," right? And we'd move on to the next person. But Steve decided that that wasn't good enough as he took over the public defender's office in New Orleans, which was then a part-time office, took it over and sort of helped to transform that office. Steve decided that people had a right to make bail arguments. And so Steve started saying, actually, that's not okay. I need to make an argument for my client, a bail argument for my client. And the judge said, "We don't do that here." Steve said, "Objection." Judges said, Steve said, "I'm going to have to object to your I'm going to have to object to you telling me I can't do that. Like, I'll hold you in contempt if you don't shut up." And Steve said, "I'm going to have to object to the fact that you're going to hold me in contempt." And so a year later, Steve kept up these antics. And so one of my first jobs when I came to New Orleans to work was to actually help get Steve out of jail after he'd been arrested. But it worked out, obviously, incredibly well. What this work Steve did in New Orleans and in Louisiana to help reform criminal defense is nothing short of inspiring. It's a different place down there now, and it wouldn't have happened without Steve Singer. So let me welcome him and to talk about his time at Post-Katrina New Orleans.
Thanks, Rob. Lots of lies, which is always a good way to start things. I guess the first thing I'd say is that things are better, but coming from where we were at, things had to get somewhat better. But it's not. It's still a work in progress. One of the things I think that I took away from doing the reform effort in New Orleans was, at some level, you do have to take the long view. Rome wasn't built in a day. Certainly the New Orleans Public Defender's Office didn't go from being one of the worst places. There was an I remember sitting around the office one day, and there was an NPR report by Ari Shapiro, and he was interviewing somebody from NLADA, David Carroll, and one of our local board members, and then somebody from the state board. And it was this 10 or 15-minute piece on how the New Orleans Public Defender's Office had gone from being one of the worst public defender's offices in the country to one of the best. And I was sitting around with a couple of my management team, and we were looking around at like basically a disaster zone, and we just started laughing on the floor, because of course nothing could have been further from the truth. But just to give you an idea, I just want to talk a little bit about what the pre-Katrina New Orleans Public Defender's Office looked like, because it is what a lot of public defender offices, or what indigent defense looks like and still looks like in many areas in the South. So pre-Katrina, as Rob mentioned, and it was sort of, once I actually got in and took over the Public Defender's Office, it was sort of awe-inspiring to see the way it had been very carefully structured. It was run by the judges, and I recognized it immediately as it was run essentially as a patronage system. And I came from Chicago, where patronage is the most important thing. So I could easily identify it as a patronage system. And basically the way it worked was the criminal court judges appointed a board of directors for the Public Defender's Office. And that board of directors consisted of private criminal defense attorneys who contributed lots of money to their judicial campaigns and got all their friends and family and other people to contribute to the judicial campaigns. And then the board members hired a director, but the director had no power to do any hiring and firing or any real management. It was the board and the judges who did the management. And what they did was, of course, they hired the judges' friends and family members as public defenders, and their own friends and family as public defenders. And in fact, what a lot of them did was, since the Public Defender's Office was part-time, their associates at their firms would work at the public defender's office so that their public defender's salary was subsidizing the private criminal defense lawyer's law firm. They were being subsidized so they didn't have to pay them that much. The other thing, of course, was that no money went to anything other than people's salaries, okay? There were no offices. The judges just, out of some grand gesture, gave them a free room in the courthouse where they could sort of drop their umbrella and their coat and their briefcase before they went to court. They had no telephone system. They had no voicemail. They had 4 computers, 2 of which were hooked up to the internet by dial-up connections. They had 1 Xerox machine, which was usually broken. They took telephone messages. They had someone just write it down on a piece of paper and sort of stick it up on a bulletin board. And things were very rudimentary. And the other thing I found was that in the year, when I started going through the books, in the entire calendar year, in the year prior to Katrina, they had spent on expert services a grand total of $9,000 for a court system that has 12,000 cases. And I had come over from doing capital work, where I spent $9,000 in like 45 minutes. And it was clear that the reason for all of these things was that the money needed to all go to people because the people in a patronage system, they're the only people that then they can contribute back, and they can get their friends and family to contribute back to the judges, right? Xerox machines, computers, office space, voicemail systems, telephones, these things don't make campaign contributions. They don't put signs up the day before an election. They don't do any of these things that make things work. So that was all considered a waste of money. As was filing motions. The other great thing about this system was that the lawyers were part-time, but they were on salary, which was great because if you think about it, they were part-time and then they had their own private practice. So if you think about it, since they got paid the same amount, whether they spent 2 hours or 2 minutes on their public defender cases, it of course incentivized spending 2 minutes on your public defender cases, getting done with them as fast as possible, so that you could then spend the bulk of your time on your private paying clients. Not coincidentally, this worked very well for the judges and prosecutors, the fact that the lawyers spent very little time on their cases because there were no motions, there was very little argument, very little litigation, not contesting anything. And basically, if you looked at it, the way the public defender's office was what they really wanted was they just, each day a public defender would just go to the courtroom and be there and just sort of sit there while the judge and the prosecutor sort of ran through the docket. And it was really just, well, the US Constitution and the Supreme Court says we have to have a public defender, we have to have a lawyer there, so we need a name to put on the transcript. But the role of the public defender was to just, it was they were basically like the same thing as a clerk or a deputy sheriff or a court reporter. They were just part of the judge's staff that helped facilitate moving cases through the system. They were sort of a necessary component. And as soon as the judge was done, whether that was at 10, at 11, whatever, the public defender would leave. And in fact, one great story was that when we took over the public defender's office and we looked at the books, there was one judge who had decided he didn't want any case lasting on his docket more than 30 days. He wanted to move everything through really quickly. And he had been friends with a public defender who had previously been in the prosecutor's office when he was in the prosecutor's office. So he's like, look, I want you to be my one full-time public defender rather than having to deal with these other guys so that we can move cases through the docket. And the lawyer, of course, said, but they only pay me like $35,000. They only pay me half time. I can't afford to do that. Judge said, don't worry about it. We'll fix that. And so what the judge did was the judge paid the lawyer extra money to be his one full-time public defender. And the best part of this system was that the funds that the judge paid the lawyer out of was what we called judicial expense funds, which was basically fines and fees paid by probationers, people put on probation. So basically what was going on was the lawyer would go to the client and say, look, if you plead guilty, I promise you, you won't get jail time. Of course, the lawyer was always right about not getting jail time because you can't find somebody who's in jail. So the lawyer would talk the client into pleading guilty. The client would plead guilty. The judge would give the person probation with fines and fees, and then the lawyer and the judge would split the fines and fees, was essentially how this operated. That judge once we got the books and stuff and outed him, that judge, of course, then immediately got promoted to the intermediate appellate court once that came to light, and he's now the district attorney for Orleans Parish. So he's the chief law enforcement person. But anyway, that gives you a picture of what things looked like pre-Katrina at the office. So things were pretty bad. And the justice system, and you could recognize it pretty quickly. Fortunately, and one of the things I do have to say as a caveat is, I don't necessarily have the best lessons for step-by-step instructions on how to reform a public defender's office, because my step one is to have a major hurricane and have your city under 8 to 10 feet, 80% of your city under 8 to 10 feet of water for 3 or 4 months. That's sort of hard. That may be a hard step to get. But in point of fact, it helped a lot, because one of the biggest impediments to reform, as people like Steve Bright can tell you in the South, is you've got this sort of ensconced, entrenched group, okay? And one of the big lessons I learned is that, and you're going to hear a lot, I think, from other panelists about things like structure and getting more money for public defenders. And from my perspective, some of the things I learned from the reform effort in New Orleans is those things are all nice, and there's no question that good lawyers will do better in a good structure than in a bad structure. And good lawyers and good people will do better where there's more money than where there's less money. But one of the things I learned was that you can't just throw money at the problem, and you can't just change structure. And in fact, in Louisiana, the National Legal Aid and Defender Association went through some big statewide reform efforts and spent a lot of time and money, and they got some good things done in terms of passing new legislation. But I can tell you that it has had very, very little effect on the quality of representation in indigent defense services throughout the state of Louisiana. And the reason is because if you just throw more money or just change a good structure, no matter how much money and no matter how good a structure you have, if you don't have the right people, if you don't have good people who are committed, who are energetic, and if you don't have good leadership that has a commitment to reform and a commitment to the clients, it's not going to make a damn bit of difference. It just won't. And that the thing I discovered was, and it's sort of this deep, dark secret, I think, or maybe something that lawyers don't like to talk about, especially those of us in the community, because nobody wants to talk bad about anybody else. People will tell you, that's the one thing I'm not shy about, is I'm okay with that, is that, quite frankly, the thing that matters most is the people. Because when I started out in the public defender's office in New Orleans and started fixing it, which was in about September of 2005, there were basically five lawyers, 1 director, and 1 administrative person. And by the time I left in 2009, we had 53 lawyers and 120 employees. And the thing that helped the most was Katrina and the emptying out of the city emptied out the public defender's office, because, as I said, it was run as a patronage system. Most of the money came from, lots of people talk about parking tickets, none of it came from parking tickets. The money came from basically an assessment, a $45 assessment on every criminal conviction, okay? And in Louisiana, traffic cases, moving traffic violations are not decriminalized. So no matter how high your murder rate is, or your armed robberies, or your rapes, right, even if there's a couple hundred of those, it's a drop in the bucket. What the public defender's office was really financed on was traffic tickets, right, and this assessment on traffic tickets, because you'll have tens and 20,000s of those, and that's where most of the money came from. So when the hurricane hit and the city was emptied out for 3 or 4 months, of course there was no money, because there were no traffic lights, there were no cops, there were no people, no nothing. And the judges and the lawyers, both the board and the lawyers who worked at it, they of course immediately lost any interest in the public defender's office, because their only interest in it was to get a hold of this pile of public money. A small pile, but a couple $1 billion of public money. And so that made taking over the public defender's office a heck of a lot easier, because there was not an ensconced, entrenched current bureaucracy that had to be ousted. They just sort of left. The other thing that was really critical to the reform efforts in New Orleans is you need someone on the inside, okay? You don't necessarily need lots of people on the inside. And one of the mistakes I think a lot of places make in terms of reform that slows down reform and causes it not to really get off the ground is they try and get lots of stakeholders in, okay? And get all the stakeholders to the table. And that can be really difficult and really time consuming. And I'm not sure it's necessarily worth it. You need a couple, one or two, okay? We had, and the thing I had is that I was friends with the chief judge of the criminal court, who had been a professor at Loyola in my position before I was at Loyola. And that was the one person we had on the inside. And we were able to do a lot just from having that one person on the inside and have that sort of influence things. And I almost think having too many stakeholders sometimes brought into the table sometimes dilutes it so much that you don't get effective reform because you can't keep enough of the cohesion. So one of the things that really helped was just sort of experiencing Katrina and living through Katrina. And one of the things we saw during Katrina was, the way I like to put it is that Katrina didn't cause any of the dysfunction in the criminal justice system in New Orleans, contrary to a lot of reports or whatever. All it did was expose what was already there, okay? So, for example, like you saw pictures of public defenders who were working out of their cars and had files in their cars or didn't have any files at all. They didn't know who their clients were. Well, let me tell you, I was inside the public defender's office in the courthouse, within a week or two after Katrina, when the city was all underwater. There was no water in the public defender's office. If they didn't have files, that was because they never had files. They had no case management system. They didn't know who their clients were. As a consequence, when their clients got spread out throughout the state of Louisiana to various facilities, okay, and even to other states, they became nameless, faceless people, and they suffered horrendous abuse. Abuse by guards, abuse by other inmates at the instigation of guards, or certainly with their acquiescence in it, because these were all poor African-American folks from New Orleans who were hated in throughout the rural, mostly white, largely white rest of the state of Louisiana. And I remember one day going to the Hunt Correctional Center, which is not too far from Baton Rouge, and where a lot of most of the New Orleans inmates were initially evacuated. And what they had done was they just fenced in a large field and put all the New Orleans inmates in this large field. And the guards even the guards were so afraid they wouldn't go in there. In order to feed the inmates, what they would do at mealtime was the guards would just take sandwiches and bottles of water and just chuck them over the fence, which of course meant that people who were big and strong and adult, they got food and water. The weak and the powerless, they didn't do so well. They didn't get very much. So there were all of these nameless, faceless people throughout the system. Nobody knew who they were. They were all lost in the system. And there was no reason for it. There was no reason why they couldn't have been identified and couldn't all have lawyers. The problem was that's just not the way the public defender's office operated. They didn't have clients. They had courtrooms and judges that they went to work for, and each day they would just handle whatever was on the docket and then leave. So they didn't really have any clients or represent anybody. So once we saw what was happening, a small group of us got together and decided, okay, well, now's a good opportunity to try and fix things. And with the help of the chief judge, we were able to engineer a takeover of the local board, because most of the board members had either disappeared or died during Katrina and were gone. And we got a new good reform board in that allowed us to then do some of the reforms. And we did basic, it was pretty easy, basic things like getting office space, telephones, voicemail, computers, Xerox machines, just basic things that lawyers need. But the other thing was and the most important thing was hiring a cadre of new lawyers, okay? And that was really the most critical thing, was to replace the lawyers, was to get people in there who really cared about the work, would be energetic, get a new group of young people who would be really energetic and wanted to work. And that was the most important thing to do. And I think in terms of, and it's hard to recruit good people, because it's hard. I was talking with some other folks just before things got started, and it is hard to identify who those people are, but I think it can be done. One of the first things I learned was I didn't pay attention, is not to pay attention to my own instincts and my own judgments from in-person interviews. I could learn basically nothing about somebody from a half-hour, 45-minute, hour-long in-person interview. I remember one person that we hired was from the NYU clinic, and Randy Hertz, who I knew well, and many of the people here know, he's a very good lawyer. He highly recommended this person, said they were greatest thing since sliced bread. We should just hire the person, no questions asked. She came down for an interview, and I and a couple of the other managers interviewed her, and we got done with the interview, and we're like, I just don't get it. I'm like, she was just sort of flat, not very energetic, just didn't seem to be much there. She was okay, but not much there. So then we got on the phone and we called Randy back, and he said, no, just trust me. This person's great. Just hire her, you'll be happy. So we did. She turned out to be awesome. One of the best public defenders we ever had. So one of the things I learned was not to trust so much on in-person interviews, but to rely a lot more on other good people who we knew were good, who had much more experience with the person, day-to-day experience with the person, and really knew the person well. The other thing I learned that was very important in terms of recruiting good people, two other things is, and they both relate to leadership. And I think in terms of leadership, the two most important things are, one, you have to be able to not just have, but to be able to demonstrate a real commitment to reform, a real commitment to moving forward. And the way I would put it is, you have to move things forward. The best public defenders, the best people that do this kind of work in defense reform, I think of like Kathy Bennett and Jeff Shear and Steve Bright, you have to have a mission. The lawyers have to feel like they are part of something, and part of something that is moving forward. Doing day-to-day public defender work is a tremendous grind, and it takes a tremendous toll on the lawyers on a day-to-day basis. It's just really hard. There's too many clients, there's not enough time, there's too much injustice that goes on in the system, and it can really be crushing, okay? And so it's not enough, I don't think at least, in my experience, to just send lawyers to go do this day-to-day work. There has to be sort of a larger mission for the office, and the office needs to do other things. The leadership of the office needs to do other things to keep the office energized. I think it comes down to, you have to make the work fun. You have to make it fun and interesting in order to energize people and keep good people and attract good people. They need to feel like they're part of some larger effort, as opposed to just simply sending them out on a day-to-day grind to represent individual defendants. The other part about leadership is, once you hire and find good people, they need to feel like they have the unquestioned backing and support from management. In my case, that was really easy. It was no problem, and the reason it was no problem is I had a rule: no one ever got locked up except me, and I got locked up a lot. I went to jail lots. I got held in contempt lots, and I got thrown to jail a lot. So it made it easy to demonstrate to the lawyers. I didn't just sit in the office. I came over to court, I argued with the judges, I got held in contempt, and the lawyers could see that I would back them and support them. Whether I agreed or disagreed with what they were doing, when I went over to court, I defended my lawyers, okay, and I always made sure I took the hit for them. And lawyers, once you get good people, they need to feel that. One of the best moves I ever made, I remember in 2007, there was a backlash with the Louisiana bar. Because the post-Katrina year, they had accepted, they went easy on the bar exam because they felt sorry for all the third-year law students. And so they let everybody into the bar, basically. And then they saw the next year, oh my God, we've got too many lawyers, the city's not coming back, we need to tamp down on this. And the way they tamped down on it, of course, was they basically flunked everyone who was from out of state. And it's very easy to tell in Louisiana, the bar exam, because it's a civil code jurisdiction rather than a common law jurisdiction. So the terminology is different. There's all these catchphrases and words, and so it was very easy to tell. So we had a new group of lawyers, and of 10 lawyers that we had spent a lot of time recruiting from all over the country. I think only one of whom was from Louisiana, and none of them passed the bar. And I remember my two top managers saying, "Oh my God, this is the worst crisis." In fact, they still think that was the worst crisis to ever hit the office. And my reaction was, "No, it'll be okay. Don't worry. I've seen worse. It's been worse. Trust me on this one." It was worse, and certainly right after Katrina. But one of the things that there was a lot of pressure to do was to cut their salaries, because there was a lot of political pressure from the judges about how we were hiring people from out of state and bringing people from all over the country, especially from more carpetbaggers from up north, to come down and do this work. And so they were forcing the interim director and the board to cut their salaries. And so what the board did was cut all of their salaries. I think we'd written them letters promising them all $40,000 a year, and they cut them down to like 35 or 37.5 or something, since they hadn't passed the bar and could only be paralegals. And so what I did in reaction to that was I just cut them a check to make up the difference of their salaries, because my view was we had sent them a letter. We had promised them something. We had promised them that if they came down and helped us in New Orleans and came to work in New Orleans under really difficult conditions in a city that was still largely destroyed by Katrina and wasn't really functioning, that we would pay them $40,000 a year. And that was the one thing we had said we would do. And whether we were right or wrong, and whether it was dumb or stupid to not put, well, we'll only, maybe it would have been smarter to say you make X amount until you pass the bar, and then you make more after you pass the bar. But right or wrong, we hadn't done that. Okay, we made a mistake, we've been stupid. But the one thing you can't do in leadership is when you make a mistake, your lawyers can't pay for it, okay? You have to take the hit for it. And so that was something that I learned early on, and that I think went a long way in terms of leadership and building a level of trust with the lawyers, that the lawyers knew we had their backing. So I would say that those are some of the main things I learned, is that the most important thing is people, not money or structure. Money or structure, more money and better structure will help. But if you go to some places in the South where they have really bad offices or a really bad indigent defense system, if you just go and lobby for more money and get the current system more money, it is not going to do anything. It is just not going to do it. Which is different than if you already have a good system, then getting more money and a better structure, yes, that will help. And you really have to have committed leadership, which is really hard and really difficult. I had huge advantages because I knew I wasn't going to be there forever. For me, this was a turnaround project, a reclamation project. It was something to do that I was very interested in doing post-Katrina, but I knew I was going to be out after 2 or 3 years, which made it a lot easier to make hard decisions because I didn't want to keep the job. One of the other things I learned was, and that Ron Sullivan also will tell you about, is in any kind of reform effort, it's really important to have a fall guy. Everybody, the old system and the people, the entrenched powers, they need to have someone to blame. And so you need somebody to fill that role. And Ron Sullivan and I filled that role because we were doing it for a short period of time, and they were both going back to our jobs, his here at Harvard, mine teaching at Loyola. And so, for example, 2 weeks ago, there was a similar conference to this, a Gideon conference at Tulane in New Orleans, to talk about the history of the Orleans Public Defender and the reform efforts there and where to go from here going forward. I didn't get invited. I don't get to go. And neither does Ron Sullivan. Okay, we don't get invited. We're the fall guys. We're the people that they hate. But you need that so that you can then transition, and that's a very important facet of doing this reform effort. I think where the Orleans Public Defenders is now, sort of mixed reviews. You know, one of the things I talked about is, and one of the things that's really hard, especially after you've been doing public defender work for a long time and sort of this kind of work, is a lot of lawyers, and I think this happens in public defenders, I think it happens in all areas, is they confuse helping the lawyers versus helping the clients, okay? And those two things, and what happens to lawyers, and I've seen this a lot, I saw this particularly with recent things with, for example, the National Legal Aid and Defender Association, which is an organization that I have a long history with, my family has a long history with, my dad was one of the original executive board members of it, and I think in some respects they've lost their way because what they do is they represent the lawyers, but they don't necessarily represent the clients. And I can give you I just want to give you a couple of quick examples of how that works. For example, one of the things that was proposed and that was ultimately adopted by the state legislature was to get more money for the lawyers, charging like a $40 application fee on the clients who wanted to apply for a public defender to bring more money in the system, okay? You know, and that was something that I remember calling up an LADA and I'm like, this is just really messed up. It helps the lawyers, it gets the lawyers more money, but does this really benefit the clients? There's something I'm involved with right now, another example of it at a more local level, is that one of the things we instituted was vertical representation, where lawyers represent clients from first appearance, the same lawyer, all the way through to trial and sentencing. And that created a lot of friction because it meant lawyers were in all different courtrooms, and judges were, of course, unhappy that they didn't have like their public defender in the courtroom constantly to help them move through the docket more quickly. They had to get lawyers from other places. So one of the things the public defender's office has done is to group lawyers into clusters so that they're not in all 12 different courtrooms in the courthouse, they're only in 3 or 4. And the way they did this was by having cases, knowing where the case is going right from the beginning, okay? But the way they did that was that it's by date of offense, and unfortunately for lots of crimes like illegal possession of stolen goods or for arrests on drug warrants and things like that, the date of the crime can be manipulated by the police and the prosecutors so that the easy slam dunk cases, right, those cases go to the pro-defense judges because it doesn't matter whether you win the marginal calls or not in those cases. You're going to win, the prosecutor's going to win no matter what. But then the hard cases where they need some of the close calls, those cases end up going to the really pro-prosecution judges. So, and the problem is that it's a system that they've sort of come up with since I left, something that I held off for several years because I didn't want to do it, that it helps the management run the office and it helps the lawyers run the office, but it hurts the clients, okay? And I think sometimes, I think in this work, we're so invested in this work, public defenders, that we start to confuse what's good for us versus what's really good for the clients. And that's something that's really hard and you need to keep in mind. So those are my perspectives, having done some reform work in New Orleans. Thank you very much.